Story time. So, back in 1946, when my late grandfather was about 80 years old, four fellas by the name of Howard Vollum, Jack Murdoch, Miles Cypri, and Glenn McDowell decided to pull together about $50,000 each in today's money to start a small company that will later be known as Tektronix. Their first product wasn't what they're known for, an oscilloscope, or rather a video calibrator, the Type 101, very aptly named, the first product 101. Soon after that, they launched the Type 511. 511 was a 5-inch CRT scope, meaning that the tube was 5 inches in diameter. It only had one channel, the second one in the name, and the last one in the name means it was the first product. The 511 was actually very revolutionary as an oscilloscope because it had something that no other oscilloscope had till that moment, the trigger knob. It could trigger and synchronize to the waveform that you were trying to observe. They kept making it, improving it iteratively until about the early 50s. In the early 50s, they decided that they had enough of sourcing CRTs from other manufacturers like Dumont or RCA, and they decided to build their own. And the first tube that they ever made was the T51. This baby right here made its way into the 530 and 540 series of oscilloscopes, the 535, 545, etc. And there's a lot of stuff to talk about when it comes to tech-built CRTs. They were by far the best. Tech went to such extreme care and perfectionism when designing these tubes. They were basically unbeatable. The helical post-acceleration grid, or what you would call it, was simulated by an analog computer using resistors to map the strength of the electric field generated by the anode. Everything was precise to basically millionths of an inch, microns, and their tubes were the sharpest, the brightest, the longest lived, and the best. And that's what allowed them to become a huge player in the oscilloscope market, even starting from those days. A distinctive feature of oscilloscopes from Tech back in those days were the ceramic strips that they were using instead of PCBs or point-to-point wiring, rather. Their ceramic strips were made by their very competent ceramics department. I'm going to insert a few photos of what they look like. And they were sintered pressed aluminum ceramics that were plated, shaped and plated such as to accept the component leads of the components that were being inserted and wired into circuit. The silver plating was actually so delicate and so precise that repeated soldering to one of those ceramic strips with a non-silver bearing alloy would actually destroy the bond between the ceramic and the plating and end up ruining the ceramic strip. For that reason, most Tektronix oscilloscopes actually contained a roll of solder formulated to Tektronix's requirements in order not to harm the ceramic strips when repairs were being carried out later in the instrument's life. Now, glass CRTs, like any other glass vacuum tubes, are very difficult to manufacture. And for this reason, Tektronix started developing hybrid tubes. So they figured, hey, we got a very competent ceramics department. Why don't we use that for vacuum tubes for CRTs? And this is the result. So Tech made the first, and I'm pretty sure that only hybrid CRTs that have a ceramic front and a glass back. This is the electron gun. Deflection plates are right around in here, and this whole side, which is critical to the performance of the CRT basically, and the most sensitive to mechanical deformation and non-idealities, is made out of ceramic, which is very stiff and rigid and is very easy to form in a shape previous to sintering or cooking or vitrification, basically, if you want to call it that. I think that's the correct term. And is vacuum tight, doesn't outgas, and is very, very stable in time. The biggest challenge was figuring out the materials to make the connection, a vacuum tight connection between the glass side and the ceramic side of the tubes. You have to think about the fact that this barely has any thermal dilation coefficient, and glass doesn't really like to be bent because it shatters, and this had to be done in 2 places. This is a bit easier because this is just a flat sheet of glass that doesn't have to bend or distort in any way, and it doesn't even get hot. But this is kind of more difficult because there is a hot electron gun sitting in right here. Tektronix was the be-all and end-all of oscilloscopes, and they had a lot of premieres. For example, the Type 519 was the first oscilloscope to get to 1 gigahertz of bandwidth, or 1 gigacycle per second, as they called it back in the day. They also invented the first bistable storage tube and the first bistable storage oscilloscope, the Type 549. It was a massive success because you could look at one-shot events without needing to have a camera connected to the oscilloscope, and it could save the image for up to hours. After figuring out this hybrid ceramic, they started developing more and more products. They started building computer terminals based on CRTs with storage. They had a monstrous CRT terminal that was, I believe, 26-inch and diagonal across. The model is the 4016, which used to cost about $80,000 in today's money in 1974. A series of oscilloscopes that prolifically made use of the ceramic glass hybrid CRTs was the 7000, which was exceedingly popular for professional use. They were very reliable scopes, very versatile, very high performance, and they had basically endless configurability. They had endless configurability. Depending on what plugins you used with those scopes, you could turn them into sampling scopes, you can turn them into curve tracers, you could hook up active probes, current probes, AC/DC current probes, you could hook up spectrum analyzers, you could have a mixed domain oscilloscope back in the 70s, which is a feature that has only crept up again back in the late 2010s, I think, with the launch of the MDO 4000 series. Now, the MDO 3000, which I also have, is also technically a mixed domain oscilloscope, but you can't see a spectrum and a time domain and a frequency domain graph at the same time. This was a feature that was lost for a very long time in tech scopes. They also developed the fastest usable all-around oscilloscope, the Type 7104. Actually, they haven't been calling them Type after the 576 curve tracer, but I still kind of like referring to them as Type 7104. The 7104 was, and still is, the fastest CRT scope ever made. It's an actual scope as opposed to the 519, which is basically just a sheet of graphing paper for very high speed. It has usable front-end amplifiers that go down to 10 millivolts. It has time-based control that goes down to seconds, I believe. Not that you want to do that in the 7104, but you get the point. I'm going to make a very in-depth video about the Type 7104 when it finally gets to me, because I managed to find one. Another interesting thing was that tech products had an exceedingly long service life. Most of the products that they had, that I've looked at, had almost a 20-year lifespan. The longest, I think, was the Type 547, which was one of the best analog oscilloscopes ever made. It had dual time bases, and you could look at two different signals on two different time bases, sort of akin to a dual beam tube, but without the complexity or expense of a dual beam tube scope. Speaking of dual beam, one of the coolest oscilloscopes that Tech ever made was the Type 556. It was the fastest at the time dual beam scope. It was a complete monster, weighing in at almost 40 kilograms without any plugins. It could take 2 letter series or 1 series plugins, and it could see signals up to 50 megahertz in bandwidth. And it also was one of the first oscilloscopes to have a delayed, a usable delayed time base. I think most techs by that time had the delayed time base, but having dual beam means that you can see a very slow signal sped up or magnified quite a lot on 2 different time bases without any flicker. Some of the most interesting plugins for the 5 series, and this is a small accolade that I'm making here, is for example the 1A4, which is a 4-channel amplifier. So 556 could conceivably have up to 8 input signals at the same time. The 1S1 is a 1 gigahertz sampling plugin for the 500 series. And they also had spectrum analyzers, which were at first OEM'd by a different company, but they were very, very good. Not as good as HP's 141 series of modular instruments, but they were a tiny fraction of the cost. And that's basically where Tektronix kind of ends, for me at least, because in the early 90s, they ceased production of most CRT scopes. Most of the 7000 series was killed off in 1992 or 1993 or something like that. And they focused more on digital storage scopes and other stuff like that, modern stuff. Nobody needed CRTs anymore. And I find it kind of sad, because CRTs are wonderful. And just to prove a point, what I have here is the 224, which is possibly the cutest digital oscilloscope in the world that features a CRT. This thing is tiny. It's been featured quite a lot on the internet by some very prolific YouTubers so far. In particular, Mr. Carlson did a video about changing the battery pack on one of these from the initial 8-volt, 1.5 amp hour sealed lead acid battery to alkalines, or actually rather nickel metal hydride batteries. I think he put some Duracells in it. I'm not going to do that just yet. This one doesn't have the battery, luckily. It didn't come with the leaky lead acid battery inside. It works perfectly, and it's actually just such a joy to behold and look at. And this thing has one of the smallest CRTs in a tube scope ever. If I'm not mistaken, only a few Russian models that were meant for high schools and education had smaller CRTs. And this is actually usable. This is a 60 megahertz sampling scope that can actually see my fast pulsar. This thing, I talked about it in a previous video. Before the 4 came a number of other scopes, such as the 212, for example, which we have here. These are, this one is a dear friend of mine's. I just managed to bring it up a couple of days ago, and it still works, surprisingly. It's got a very interesting power supply. It's just a capacitive dropper, and cap values need to be changed according to the line voltage and operating frequency, line frequency basically, of where you want to run these. I've got some parts on order for recapping this and giving it a bit of a tidy up. It sadly it's missing the original probes, which should have come out through a couple of holes in there and wound this way. There's an arrow showing you which way to wind them around. And I'm going to try and give it some adequate probes, something that would fit the aesthetic. So I apologize for the long-windedness of my rant, but it wasn't actually a rant, it was a story. Anyway, there's so much that I could talk about when it comes to Tektronix. They had so many world firsts. They were such an inventive company, and they did so many amazing things for science in general. There's a fun story that the 519s were all used in the Manhattan Project. So when they would be bought by the US government, they would be sent out to a test site. They would detonate one of the bombs. The EMP would basically wipe out almost half of them, and they would send them back to Beaverton for decontamination and repairs, and they would go back to the Nevada desert for the next test. Later, when they had the 7104s, they had a boatload of 7104s connected to long cables to whatever they were trying to measure, with cameras attached to them and Polaroid film loaded into them. And there's a cool image. I'll try and insert it somewhere around here so you can see what I'm talking about. Imagine having a room filled with dozens of gigahertz bandwidth scopes, all with Polaroid cameras stuck to the front of them, and there's millions of dollars of investment riding on the fact that somebody put film and armed the shutter for each and every one of those oscilloscopes. So, and the last thing why I'm saying that Tektronix kind of went away ever since the 90s, well, they still had a lot of innovative products. They still make very good oscilloscope even to this day, but they've kind of gone mainstream now. I mean, not that they've gone mainstream. I'm not a fanboy complaining that their favorite band is not indie anymore, it's commercial. They kind of went with the pack. And when I look at tech scopes these days, I don't really see what I see in a 224, for example, or in one of the curve tracers or something like that. Oh, by the way, they also bought Keithley in the meantime. I think you all should know that. And surprisingly, Keithley and Tektronix were established in the same year. Not in the same place, that would have been far too crazy of a coincidence, but both Tektronix and Keithley were born in 1946. So this is all I have for you today. By the way, this is a vacuum tube out of a 535 power supply. This is a 6080 twin triode. This is a test adapter for a TO something transistor for a 7CT1N. I think you've seen it. And this is the standard test adapter for the 576. These were just props for the moment. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed my 20-minute crash course on the history of Tektronix. I'll be back with more videos about more tech stuff, including the 556, the 576, when I get at the 7104, and the 224, I plan on also doing something with the battery to make it usable as a portable oscilloscope. There's only one more thing that I wanted to show you. So this is 1993 or 4 something vintage. This is 2024. So there's basically almost 30 years difference between these two scopes. No, this is a 200 megahertz scope. It's got a multimeter, it's got a signal generator inside. I love this thing, but this is just like having a classic car in comparison to a new Volkswagen e-up or something like that. I would rather drive this 2 days out of the year than use this as a daily driver, if you know what I mean. It's all about the feel of the thing. This just gives me the warm and fuzzies. This is more a tool. Mind you, at the time when this was brand spanking new, this would have given me the same feeling as this does for me now. So I hope you understand why I just love collecting vintage Tektronix stuff. Okay, I've ranted enough. Have a great day and thanks for watching again. Bye.